in the implementation world, the worst words in the English language is this is the way we've always done it.
Welcome back to Plug and Pay, a talk show where we speak with inspiring payroll leaders about interesting, exciting topics that are shaping the global payroll industry. I'm Mark Oliver Fiedler, founder and CEO of Payzar and the host of the show. And I'm here together with our head of service delivery, Max van der Klies-Bussink. Max, how are you today?
Good, Mark. I'm off to a great start in 2025. I'm really excited about today's conversation because this was a promise I made to our guest at Congress last year. And fortunately, I've kept my promise. So I'm really happy to say that Karen Settembrino is our guest. She is the product director for human capital management at Alithya, who brings extensive experience. While we were chit-chatting, really impressive experience in payroll and HCM, and especially implementations. So Karen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Max and Mark.
Karen, it's great to have you here. And I know you've been in this industry for a few years now. So could you start off by just sharing a little bit about your journey into payroll and the different experiences that you've had along the way?
Sure, I'd love to, Mark. Like most payroll people, I fell into payroll by accident. I was supposed to be a large animal veterinarian. I had a full ride scholarship for that as well, coming out of high school. Talk about a switch, right? I've been in the payroll industry for over 45 years. Amazed I can actually admit to that. And I started out as a payroll clerk on punch cards. Now, I'm dating myself when I say that. I worked my way up through the years to payroll manager and director before I started my career in consulting. I've been in consulting for 26 years now, and since 1998. And I took a break actually from consulting to work for the software I've been implementing all along, which is Oracle software. I worked directly for them. One of the roles I had was the US legislative analyst responsible for compliance with their newest product, the cloud product. So that's where I have been in that space. And 4 years ago, I decided to go back into consulting, and that's where I am now.
Wow, what an experience, Karen. And just for me, so what is a payroll clerk on punch cards? What are punch cards, Karen?
Oh my God, punch cards. Well, back before computers, desktops, before what we know now, you would have punch cards where you would key data into a machine, almost like a teletype machine, and it would punch the data onto the card, and you'd run the card through the card reader, which would create data in the old-fashioned computer systems, very old.
Wow.
Very nicely explained. I like how you I think a lot of people are not quite familiar exactly with how that technology worked, but
yeah, it was the leading edge or bleeding edge at that point in time. So this was before desktop computers, before even the big rooms,
or swipe screen, touch screen. Everything is so self-service enabled now. You needed punch cards, right? That you had to.
It was a very interesting time.
Yeah. Hey Siri, process my payroll. It doesn't quite work yet, right? We're not there yet.
I tried it on Alexa one day, and it wouldn't work for me either.
No, I once tried as well. I said, Siri, can you process my payroll? No, that's too damn hard. I said, the first sane thing that came out of your mouth, Siri. But anyways, is this maybe why time cards are still being called time cards?
Actually, yes, that's one of the origins of it, is because it was physically a card or a piece of paper that people either filled out or The manager filled out, and then it was sent over to payroll to be entered onto and punched onto the punch cards and entered into the computer system that way.
Well, that I do remember from my past, Karen, where so I started my career in payroll in the oil and gas and dredging industry with people working 6 weeks on and off on ships. And they used to do time cards, time sheets, printed ones. So they had 3 or 4 sheets of paper, one for the agency, one for the captain,
Yep.
one for this, one for that. And then they had faxing machines on the ships because they wanted to get paid. So we actually, in the office, got the faxes of the time cards, hardly readable. If they were signed or not. And actually, my team and I, we were indeed punching them into computers then, but still no automated way, punching them in, double checking, 4 eyes principles. So that's, wow, okay, that brings back a lot of memories.
Just goes to show how old I am. I started payroll right out of the womb. That's what I like to say.
Well, you've helped to advance it to where it is today, right? That's maybe another way to.
Yes. The experience I have had in the many different roles I have played have played a huge part in my knowledge and being able to help the customers I work with.
Well, this may be a good time that since we went from punch cards to you implementing everything around the US and beyond, is RFPs, so requests for proposals. I know Mark and I are now on the receiving end of a lot of requests for proposals. There are good ones, there are bad ones, there are excellent ones, and there are worse ones. So I think we have probably seen them all. Maybe you have seen them all too. So from a payroll and implementation perspective, what do you see, Karen, with your experience that are the best practices that you've seen for organizations that start an RFP process?
So I very highly recommend, the best advice I could possibly give to any company looking to do this is to do your due diligence internally first. I cannot emphasize that enough. What I tell my clients is take the time up front, document each and every process and procedure that you do, whether it's the hire to retire or the time to bank. Document how you handle each individual piece of paper. And yes, there are still companies that use paper. I talk about this because knowing what you currently do helps define what the future is going to look like. And a lot of times I find customers are not prepared for even the RFP process because they haven't done the work up front. And I highly recommend doing that, whether you're at the point that you've selected your system or you selected your provider and you're ready to start the project. It's already a little bit too late at that point to actually delve into what your current processes are. The other thing I recommend is take time to validate, not only document, but validate each process and procedure. And the reason why I say that is because a lot of times when you go through this house cleaning effort, you find that there are things that you no longer need to do or no longer are working for your organization or are too antiquated or just the way they used to be. In the implementation world, the worst words in the English language is, this is the way we've always done it.
Well, actually, Karen, speaking of the way we've always done it this way, so I always start off the year by reading a book. So, and I don't know if I didn't prepare this, but let's see if I have it here. Anyway, it's the Daily Stoic, so it has 1 page for every day. And today actually was about not accepting the status quo. And this was from a Stoic philosopher who lived 60 years BC. So it was already a topic then. And now we're in freaking 2025.
Yeah, it doesn't change. It doesn't change. And, you know, that can be applied not only to payroll or implementations, it can be applied to anything that a person does. I mean, given an example, I just spent the last 2 months completely cleaning out my house, looking at every closet, looking at every drawer, taking everything out and doing the Marie Kondo on it. Did I love it? If I loved it, I kept it. If I didn't, I let it go. So things like that are really important, especially in the payroll, the HCM space, because you really find out what works and what does not work. And definitely you find out what you want to improve in your new system. The second piece of advice I like to give, which I really find helpful, although not every client does it, is know your team's resource capability. And that's very critical. There is nothing like the stress of going through an implementation and keeping your production going. And especially we in payroll. I mean, we make one mistake and it's world news, right?
Yes.
So keeping production going and participating in the implementation, you really need to know your system, your team's resource capabilities. And one recommendation that I always make is that there should be one SME or subject matter expert that is 100% assigned to the project, and you have to backfill. That is something that whenever we go into a client, we always recommend, because you need that person, that subject matter expert, to have the authority to make decisions. And a lot of times, if they don't have the authority, you have to do decision by committee, and that slows things down tremendously. The last piece of advice is to prioritize what is absolutely necessary versus what is a nice to have. And that truly is the hardest thing that clients that I've experienced go through, because everything to them is an absolute priority, but you kind of learn as you go through the progress of the implementation project what is truly an absolute necessity versus a nice to have. You know, the old adage, it's time and money. Anything can be done with time and money, right?
Yeah.
When you have
You
limited
sound like our
time.
COO now, Karen. Trevor Townsend, he always says anything can be done with time and money. Yeah.
Yes, well, when you're in an implementation project, it's limited time and limited money. So
Yeah.
you really need to be very realistic with what is absolutely necessary and what can be done in a later phase of the project, which is your nice to haves. One thing that I also talk about is understanding where the shortfalls of your current system exist. And I recommend, and this is all part of the due diligence up front, understanding those shortfalls is going to be helpful to be able to explore all the necessity that and all of the progress you're going to make in the new system. And it's going to help in building your request for proposal, because when you know the shortfalls, you're going to know this is something you need the new system to be able to do. Whether it's a system or it's a provider, it's the same thing. That's something I also talk about with the clients that I go through, especially when building your RFP, because when you build the request for proposal, you want to make sure you highlight those items. As an example, in the US, we have Fair Labor Standards Act, where we calculate overtime and we calculate a premium portion
Yeah.
that's based upon different earnings. Well, in your current system, maybe it doesn't calculate it that way, and you want the new system to do that. So that's something you would put in your RFP, saying you want to make sure the system does that. Also, one thing I have seen in the years that I've been doing implementations is that you have to make sure all of the departments are included in the RFP process. Your HR, your finance, your accounts payable, your IT, any department that's directly impacted by the new system has to be involved. And you'd be surprised when I read some of the RFPs, how many times that is not taken into consideration. And doing that results in a unified approach and vision of the project.
It's great points, Karen. Actually, just picking up on the last things you mentioned there in terms of making sure that when you're undertaking a change transformation, what we're talking about here, changing your payroll operating model or changing your external partners that you're working with, as you said, there's a lot of different moving parts and different parties that need to come together in order to make that all happen. And I'm curious about your experience in balancing the needs and expectations of the different stakeholders that you have involved in such an implementation. Like you mentioned, you have finance, you have accounting, you have IT, you have legal, you have procurement, you have HR, you have your senior management. Have you found any clever approaches, best practices, how to make sure that you keep the different parties that are involved aligned and on a happy path?
So a couple of points here. First of all, I can't emphasize enough how much upper management support is critical to the success of the project and keeping everybody moving in the same direction. If you don't have alignment, and this I've experienced very recently, where one team wanted the project and another team did not. When you don't have alignment at the C-suite level, it's impossible to get the project done. So having upper management, including your steering committee, and even your project governance committee, which can be two different things I've seen in the past, depending upon the size of the company, but not having them all be aligned on the vision of the project is critical, because ultimately all of the decision making rolls up to them. And if they're not on the same page, there's no way the project team can be on the same page. Another thing I've seen is make sure each of the roles within the project is clearly defined. And the reason why is you want to give the authority to the appropriate level of decision making. Highly recommend that, because you want your subject matter expert to be able to make decisions such as the types of earning codes, as an example. You don't want that to go all the way up to the CHRO or the CFO or the CEO. So giving the authority to the people who are the boots on the ground, making the decision makers, is really, really, really important, because otherwise you're going to create roadblocks. You're going to create decision by committee, which makes things much harder. And believe me, I've been there in that decision by committee. Working for public sector here in the United States, that's the way they do it. It's decision by committee. That's one area that I definitely emphasize the importance. Another one is 2 sets of documentation that I always recommend. One is a configuration workbook. And when I talk about this, is how is the system set up? How are your earnings defined? How are your deductions defined? What do your taxes mean? And this could be applied to any system, whether it's, your providers, when you're documenting how you're notifying the providers of the kind of earnings you need. And it can be applied to anywhere in the world, because that's the same. Also, I use what is known as a requirements traceability matrix, or an RTM. That's another one where once you go through your business process requirements and you document, this is what I need, it helps to understand those that are gaps that the system does not do for whatever reason, and how to fix those gaps, whether it's a change in the way a business process is done, whether it's change to the way the system behaves. There are so many reasons why you could possibly have gaps, but this RTM, what it does is it documents the gaps that were found, and it brings it through to test scripts, so that you always know in your project you're tackling those things that are not out of the box functionality. And the reason why these 2 things add to keeping everybody aligned and the project moving forward is because having these 2 documents available gives everybody the visibility as to how the system is being used, how it's being set up, but also how the system is going to be modified in any way, or the business process is changed in any way in order to support the new system.
Just when you mentioned the stakeholders, it brought back memories of when I did those type of projects. And then we started using this little matrix, and Mark will love this with his ECG background. A 2x2, Mark, you love a 2x2 as a
And
PC.
you can explain everything with a 2x2. Yes, I agree.
Exactly. And this was related to stakeholders, which I think is relevant in the implementation context, but I think overall in the payroll context is where you have one that says the influence or the power of stakeholders, and the other one is the interest of stakeholders, which is high or low. And then that kind of on a high level defines how you approach those stakeholders, like low interest, low influence, monitor them, but high interest, high influence / power, manage them very closely. So that helps to apply different approaches to different stakeholders. But I just wanted to add that to what you said, Karen. And maybe we talked a lot about implementation, but you also in your intro said compliance is a big thing that you focus on a lot. And we know this is kind of a foundational thing to payroll. I've heard the acronym ACT once, accurate, compliant, and timely pay. And I will focus a little bit on compliance. Something special happened today in the US that might lead to some changes in legislation, but there has always been a lot of legislative changes. So how do you approach kind of maintaining that compliance in a rapid change environment like in the US or other jurisdictions, Karen?
So to me, knowledge is power. Okay. And one of the things I do, and I did as my role as a legislative analyst, is I went out and I found resources I can use to keep up with the changing world. If anybody tells you they know everything about payroll or everything about a legislation or a legislative area, it's very, very difficult. You have to find those resources that are going to be accurate and are going to be relatable and reliable. So I always search for anything that I can get my hands on that are related to legislative changes that are coming from what I could call good sources. As an example, going directly to the IRS website, right? Reading the IRS website when I know that there's something new that's coming down the pike, or that there's something that I heard was changing. A really good example is taxation of certain earnings, right? I want to know, one of the things that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is expiring at the end of this year is moving expenses. They're going to say some of it's non-taxable again, which is the way it was prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which made it all taxable. That's an example. I use Payroll.org. Now, Payroll.org got their start as the American Payroll Association, so it was concentrating on the US, but now it's gone global, as you well know, and you participate.
Did it not even start, Karen, as the American Payroll Institute, as API, which we now know means something different, but I think it even started as API, right?
Yeah, it did. Absolutely, it did. Now, my involvement, and there are many, many people within the organization that are been involved much longer than me. I started in 1996. So I have been involved with the APA since 1996, now Payroll.org or Payo. Great resource, provides training and library content to help with compliance. There's multiple ways to find the research, being able to do your searching online, but you've got to be very careful with doing it online, because if you are looking at something that is not a direct source, sometimes you're getting people's opinions and not necessarily what actually the legislation or the change could mean. So just use the internet other than the direct source with caution, I'd say. Keeping up with certifications where available. There are multiple countries that offer certifications in payroll. Obviously, Payo or Payroll.org has their fundamental payroll certification and certified payroll professional. Those are two certifications offered here in the United States. I believe there's a CIPP in the UK, and there's one, I think, in Australia, and a couple
Jason Lowe. We have South Africa, we have the Netherlands. I think a lot of, and I don't want to open up a whole debate, but I'm going to start it a little bit. there should be a payroll organization in every country.
Oh, I agree with the
And
global
I,
environment that there is nowadays.
no, but also like a country specific. And I actually had a conversation with someone who works in that type of industry last week. And I said, actually, we should take it this far that a payroll tax return should only be submitted by someone who sits in that specific register. Because then we know that person certifies and is certified to ensure this is really compliant. That would also elevate the need for certifications. But hey, I know that's practically impossible, but I would say, why not, right? I did research once, Karen. It's at least 50% of any government's revenues comes from payroll.
Absolutely. Look at the percentage that for the United States, it's 71% of all income coming
I
into
think
the
it's
federal government.
3.2 trillion US dollars.
Yes.
0.2 trillion US dollars.
Yes. That's how important. And coming from the length of the time that I have been in payroll, what I have found, and I've heard this from many different people across many different organizations, across many different states, across countries. It's not specific to the U.S. Payroll is considered the redheaded stepchild. Okay. It doesn't get the recognition it deserves. And all of the work that companies like you, that Payzar is doing, and other companies that are doing to get the word out there about the importance of payroll and the work that we do, maybe we can change the tide and the language that people would be more receptive to the fact of the importance that payroll plays, not just in an organization, but in the country, in the world. Payroll as an industry. I mean, I look at the fact that the APA has, payroll org has over 20,000 members, right? But if you think the number of the companies that are in the United States alone or in the world, and you think of the number of people that we pay, you think of the population of the world, 20,000 is not a lot of people. And I'm on my soapbox, so I would just say I truly believe that payroll does not get the recognition it deserves. I think it needs more. I truly believe we need a seat at the C-level table. I'm one of those that rah-rahs for that. I'm kind of a little bit off topic, but all of this stems from the fact that in order to stay compliant, you need good, accurate resources. And companies or organizations like Payroll Org, we need them. We need them to be able to keep up with all of the changes that we have. If you think about it, how much payroll is impacted by things totally out of their control, whether it's legislative changes, union changes, or legal changes, or other department changes like benefits and absence and compensation. It's downstream to all of this. So there's so much that we have to be concerned about, that we need good resources. And that's why I say you have to be open to being able to use what resources you can find in the country that you're in.
Just on that point, Karen, I mean, it's not, when we talk about compliance, and of course, at the end, the buck stops with payroll, right? Because if something goes wrong, then people will start looking at and pointing their finger at payroll. But ultimately, it's a team sport, right? It's an effort where multiple different parties need to come together. And you just touched on some of them, legal, HR, to make sure that everything is done in order to protect the organization, the company, and its employees. So I'm curious, any views that you have on how payroll teams can proactively partner with their peers in legal and HR in order to ensure that compliance remains or is a top priority within the organization?
So I used a term that there's different words for it, but it's communicate, communicate, communicate. You know, the joke is location, location, location. But in this case, communication between all of these different departments, whether it's legal or human resources or any other department within an organization, and payroll, even, and then down to finance. Having that communication, that open line of communication, make sure that everybody is aware of the changes that come down the pike, but also of how the systems impact each other. And I find a lot of times people in human resources and legal don't necessarily understand what's going on in payroll and don't understand why these changes are required or why these items have impacted payroll. And I find in my role within an implementation team that I am an advocate for the payroll team in talking to the HR and the benefits and the comp team and saying to them, this is required in payroll. You need to understand that this is a rule or a law or whatever the case may be. You have to understand that we need this data to support this. And if we don't have this data to support whatever this change is from your system, from your department, we're out of compliance. So my strongest recommendation is communication between the departments, because if you don't have that communication, there's failures, there's points of failure. And that could be devastating to the payroll department in many ways.
Great, Karen. Well, I think we can talk for hours and days and weeks and years about payroll, which we probably should and which we probably will. But hey, you've shared a lot of wisdom, and to all the folks listening who most likely have an interest in payroll. So before we wrap up our lovely episodes, do you have, with all your years of experience, any final tips or advice for payroll leaders, professionals, Gen Z, Gen A, boomers, whoever is listening? Speak to them directly, Karen. What type of advice do you have for them?
I have multiple pieces of advice. First of all, I really want to see the younger generation become involved in payroll. Payroll should not be something that people fall into. I've been hearing that time and time and time again. Somehow, some way, we need to make it so that the younger generation knows that there is such thing as a career in payroll. For those people that are like me, that are at the end of their careers, we need to impart our knowledge to those people that are coming up. We need to ensure that the knowledge that we've learned over the number of years that we've been in payroll doesn't get lost because we step out of the picture. And the people that are coming up behind us have that knowledge. So it's really important to involve yourself in organizations where you can give back to that area of the community and impart your knowledge and make sure that the next generation is actually going to have as much information as they can to succeed. The other thing I'd like to say, just one more aspect from an implementation side. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to find the right partner. When you're talking about an implementation, whether it's a new provider or a new system implementation, you really need to make sure the provider or the system integrator that you work with understands your company's culture and their vision. So when you're looking for people to help you go through this process, if you are, it's really important to take a good hard look at the companies you're looking at, making sure that they work alongside of your culture and your organization's vision and your organization's goals, the long-term goals, not just getting the system up and running, but what is the 5-year and the 10-year mark going to look like? And the other thing I think I would like to say is that, you cut me, I bleed payroll. That's just who I am. Many of the people I work, many of the people I associate with that are friends of mine from Payo, we're all in the same boat. This is who we are. Payroll is a passion. There's a woman from Entertainment Partners that says payroll is sexy, right? There's so much to be learned. And with all the new technology that's coming down the pike, there's so much changing that's being done in the payroll industry that it's not just back at the punch card times. And a lot of people think it is. So that's the one thing that I would like to say. And most of all, I'm proud to be member of the payroll world. I live and breathe payroll, and I always will. And this has
Oh,
been my life and my career, and I'm very happy to say that I've lived this life and I've experienced the things that I have. You know, I've talked to CEOs of multi-billion-dollar companies and they've listened to me. That's the kind of situations you could find yourself to be involved in. So don't just discount payroll as being a behind-the-scenes job.
What a great way to end, and a great story in your own personal journey. I think from where you started with talking about the early days of payroll and the punch cards to all the experience that you've gathered along the way, and I think the passion that you talk about and bleeding payroll just in the last 45 minutes that we talked here, I think shines through. I've learned a lot from this conversation, which I always enjoy. So thank you, Karen, for sharing all your experience and insights with Max and myself and all the listeners and viewers of today's episode. Thank you so much for joining us, Karen, and for being with us. And we'll hope to see you again really soon.
I hope to see you at Congress in Orlando for 2025.
thanks so much for being on the show. We'll see you in Orlando in May.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.